They say betrayal is loud, but in my life, it arrived quietly, wrapped in smells, sweet words, and a woman who called herself my stepmother. My name is Mira Hale, and for 8 years I lived as if I didn't exist, erased from my own bloodline, pushed into the shadows by lies whispered at dinner tables and poison served in gentle tones. I learned early that when someone wants to destroy you, they don't always raise their voice. Sometimes, they simply convince the people you love that you are never worth listening to. This is not a story about revenge fueled by rage. This is a story about patience, intelligence, and what happens when people underestimate a woman who learned to survive alone and later learned how to build a world so powerful that those who broke her could never touch it again. Yeah, I was 17 when my stepmother, Clara, entered our lives like a carefully scripted character. She laughed at the right moments, touched my father's arm as if she had always belonged there, and spoke about family values with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every line. My mother had been gone for only a year when Clara arrived, and I was still learning how to breathe without her. At first, I tried to be kind. I wanted my father to be happy. I wanted peace. But Clara didn't want peace. She wanted control. Slowly, methodically, she began rewriting the story of who I was. If something went missing, it was my fault. If my father and I argued, she stood quietly behind him, later telling him how concerned she was about my attitude. She told him I was ungrateful, unstable, selfish. She said she feared for his future if I stayed in his life. And the worst part was that she never said these things when I was in the room. She planted seeds and let them grow in silence. The day my father stopped answering my calls, I knew the seeds had taken root. One missed call became 10. 10 became months. Months turned into years. When I finally stood in front of him, tears shaking my voice as I asked what I'd done wrong, he didn't even look at me. He said Clara had shown him the truth. He said I had embarrassed the family. He said I was no longer welcome in his home. 8 years. 8 years of birthdays without a message, of holidays spent alone, of hearing through distant relatives that my stepmother referred to me as a bad phase in my father's life. I worked, I studied, I survived. I told myself I didn't need them. But abandonment leaves marks. No. Success can fully erase. What saved me wasn't luck. It was curiosity. While working 2 jobs and studying at night, I discovered artificial intelligence, not as a buzzword, but as a tool. I learned how systems think, how data predicts behavior, how patterns reveal truth even when people lie. AI became my quiet companion, my teacher, my shield. I built projects no one believed in, trained models no one funded, and failed more times than I can count. Then one day, a prototype I built for emotional behavior prediction caught the attention of a tech conference investor. That investor introduced me to Ethan Cross, a businessman whose calm intelligence matched my relentless drive. He didn't save me. He respected me, and that changed everything. Ethan and I didn't fall in love overnight. We built trust the way engineers build systems, layer by layer, tested and reinforced. He was already successful, yes, but what drew him to me was not my struggle. It was my mind. When we married, it wasn't a fairy tale escape. It was a partnership. Together, we invested, expanded, and eventually bought a mansion that sat on a hill overlooking the city. A place so large it echoed when empty. A place designed not just as a home but as a living, intelligent system. Every room was integrated with an advanced AI core I had personally designed. It learned routines. It recorded interactions. It adapted. To outsiders, it was luxury. To me, it was safety. The very next day after the move, a black car pulled into the circular driveway. I was standing in the glass hallway when I saw them step out. My father, older and heavier, and Clara, still wearing that familiar smile. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I simply watched. When the doorbell rang, the house identified them before I even moved. Facial recognition, voice analysis, history retrieved. The past has a way of knocking when it smells success. They didn't apologize. They didn't hesitate. Clara walked in like she owned the place, her eyes scanning the high ceilings and marble floors. My father cleared his throat and said the words that would change everything. We're family. We're moving in. You have too many empty rooms. 8 years of silence. And this was their opening line. No regret, no shame, just entitlement dressed as blood. I smiled, and that smile confused them. Clara's eyes narrowed. She expected tears. My father expected obedience. What they didn't expect was a woman who had spent years learning how to predict human behavior better than humans themselves. I welcomed them in. I offered tea. I showed them the guest wing, and as they settled into their assumptions, the house quietly began to listen. That night, as they slept under my roof, the system logged everything, every whispered conversation, every comment Clara made about taking control, every plan to convince my husband that I was unstable. Patterns formed quickly. The AI didn't judge, it analyzed, and by morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with precision so clean it would leave them questioning their own reality. They thought they were moving in. They had no idea they had just stepped into a controlled environment, designed by the daughter they thought they had erased. And this was only the beginning. The next morning began exactly the way I planned it, quiet, polite, and unsettling in ways my father and Clara couldn't quite explain. I woke before sunrise, not because I was nervous, but because the house always signaled me when behavioral patterns shifted. The AI core had already completed its overnight analysis, mapping speech tones, identifying microaggressions, and flagging contradictions in Clara's whispered plans. When I walked into the kitchen, Clara was already there, acting domestic, touching surfaces as if she were testing ownership. She smiled too wide and said, "I barely slept. This house is so big. It feels like a waste with only 2 people living here." My father nodded behind her, avoiding my eyes as if 8 lost years could be erased simply by occupying space. I poured my coffee slowly and said nothing. Silence, I had learned, makes people reveal more than arguments ever could. By mid-morning, Clara began rearranging things. She moved decorative items, criticized the staff, and casually suggested turning my private study into a family lounge. Every suggestion was a claim, every claim a test. What she didn't know was that the house responded differently to me than it did to them. Doors opened slower for Clara. Temperature shifted subtly when my father entered rooms. Not enough to accuse, but enough to irritate. AI is not about force, it's about influence. And influence applied gently can make people feel unwelcome without ever raising a voice. Ethan noticed, of course. He always noticed, but he trusted me. When he asked quietly if I was okay, I simply said, "Let it play out." He nodded. That was all I needed. That afternoon, Clara cornered Ethan alone. The AI flagged elevated heart rate, rehearsed phrasing, and manipulation markers before the conversation even ended. She spoke about concern, about my at a distance, about how I had changed since success entered my life. She suggested she and my father move into the master guest wing permanently to help stabilize the family. Ethan listened politely. He always did. But when she finished, he asked a single question that wasn't in her script. "Why did you disappear from Mira's life for 8 years?" Clara froze. People always freeze when asked the one question they didn't prepare an answer for. That night, I invited them to dinner in the main hall, a long glass table beneath a chandelier that reflected every expression, like a mirror multiplied 100 times. The AI projected subtle sound, cuss, heartbeats slightly amplified to my perception only, breathing patterns mapped in real time. I wasn't guessing anymore, I knew. Clara laughed too loudly, telling stories where she was always the hero. My father stayed quiet, shrinking, as if he already sensed that something was slipping beyond his control. When dessert arrived, I calmly said, "Before we talk about living arrangements, there's something you should both see." I tapped the table once. The walls came alive. At first, they thought it was a home movie system. Then they heard their own voices. Clara's whisper from the night before played clearly. How she planned to push me out. How she would tell Ethan I was emotionally unstable. How she had done the same thing years ago with my father, slowly, patiently, until he believed I was the enemy. My father's face drained of color as his own voice followed, admitting he had chosen peace over truth, comfort over his daughter. Clara tried to speak, but the system lowered her microphone input automatically. She opened her mouth, and no sound came out. For the first time, she had no control over the narrative. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply looked at my father and said, "You believed her without asking me once. You erased me, and now you want access to my life because it looks comfortable from the outside." He stammered, reaching for words that came 8 years too late. Clara stood up, furious, demanding explanations, threatening legal action, embarrassment, scandal. That's when I told her the truth. The house was private property. Every guest signed a digital consent upon entry. Every recording was legal. Every manipulation attempt had been logged, time-stamped, and backed up. AI doesn't forget, and unlike people, it doesn't lie to protect itself. My father sank back into his chair. In that moment, he wasn't angry. He was small. He realized he had chosen the wrong side and the cost was permanent. I stood and said the words I had waited years to say, not with bitterness, but with clarity. You are not moving in. You're leaving tonight, Clara screamed. My father begged. The house lights brightened slightly, signaling the end of the interaction. Security was already on its way, not to drag them out, but to escort them with dignity they had never shown me. As the doors closed behind them, the house returned to its calm state. Ethan wrapped an arm around my shoulders and whispered, "You were never weak." And in that moment, standing in the silence of a home that finally felt like mine, I understood something important. This wasn't revenge. This was balance. They came seeking rooms. They left carrying truth, and what they still didn't realize was that the world, outside that mansion, the world of reputation, business, and influence, was already responding to the data they never knew they gave me. The days after they left were strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm you've been bracing for your entire life. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't need to. My father called once, then twice, then stopped. Clara sent messages filled with half apologies and thinly veiled threats, each one more desperate than the last. I read them without emotion. The AI categorized every word, every tone shift, every contradiction. And what emerged wasn't anger or guilt. It was fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing access to the life they thought they could claim. And that distinction mattered more than anything. Within weeks, the consequences unfolded on their own. Clara had built her power on image, on being perceived as graceful, loyal, indispensable. But data has a way of loosening masks. The same behavioral model I once built for survival had since evolved into a consulting system used by corporations to assess leadership, integrity, quietly, legally, and ethically. Patterns began surfacing in places Clara had touched, workplaces she influenced, committees she advised, reputations she quietly shaped. Questions were asked. Invitations stopped coming. Doors didn't slam shut. They simply failed to open. My father, stripped of her narrative, was left alone with his memories. He began to understand that silence is not peace. It's avoidance with a long-term cost. One evening, months later, he came alone. No demands, no entitlement. Just a man standing at the gate of a house he no longer felt worthy to enter. I didn't invite him in. We spoke through the intercom. He said he was sorry. Not eloquently, not convincingly, just honestly. For the first time in his life, I listened. I thanked him for the apology. And then I said something that surprised even me. Forgiveness doesn't mean access. His shoulders sagged, but he nodded. Sometimes closure doesn't look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like boundaries that finally hold. Life moved forward. Now Ethan and I expanded our work, not driven by ego, but by intention. The mansion stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like a home. The rooms weren't empty anymore. They were full of laughter, projects, late-night conversations, and a peace I had earned the hard way. The AI that once protected me became something else entirely. A reminder that intelligence, when paired with integrity, is more powerful than any manipulation. I no longer needed it to defend me. I had already proven I could stand on my own. Looking back, I don't see myself as the girl who was abandoned. I see a woman who was underestimated, and that was their greatest mistake. They thought family was something you could claim when it suited you. I learned that family is something you protect, even if that means protecting yourself from it. I didn't shock them by yelling. I didn't destroy them with revenge. I shocked them by becoming untouchable, by building a life so grounded in truth that their lies couldn't survive in its presence. So if there's one thing this story leaves behind, let it be this. When people who broke you return because you succeeded, don't ask why they came back. Ask yourself why you ever thought they deserved a place in what you built. Strength isn't loud, closure isn't cruel, and sometimes the most powerful ending is simply walking forward without turning back. This is not just my story.